My name is Kenneth Hobgood. I'm an architect in Raleigh. I've worked in the Triangle for a number of larger firms and been in this smaller office for 25 years now. I feel fortunate. I've worked with some incredibly talented people in this office. So, I'm the one that's still here. And I hope to be here for as long as possible. I can't tell you that I had some inspirational event in my life that kind of triggered this crazy passion for architecture. I always think I grew up in Johnson County, which is a farm community. There's a part of me that honestly believes some of the best architects grew up in some of the great cities, and they were surrounded by that environment and that inspiration. I didn't have any of that, but for some reason, I've always thought I wanted to be an architect from as far back as I can remember, and I don't know why. I know part of it was my father and I, as much as I loved him, we had a kind of a clashing personalities, and I knew I wanted to do something that I felt like he knew nothing about, and so architecture fit the bill. So I never did anything that I would say was a serious attempt to pursue architecture. I actually got very lucky. After I got out of the Army, I wanted to study architecture somewhere. I didn't have a great academic background. Most schools were like state. They had the admissions process was very strict. And I went around and researched schools. And the funny thing was, I found the University of Kentucky had open admission, which meant that if you could get in the University of Kentucky, you could study anything you wanted to. Their kind of direction was, okay, we're gonna take as many kids as can qualify for the university. And there might be 150 freshmen. By the end of the year, hopefully there'll only be 30 left, but we'll have the best 30. Had it not been for that admissions process, I don't think I could have gotten in an architecture school anywhere. And what was really kind of ironic was I got in Kentucky. Most people think of Kentucky as a hillbilly state. I got in Kentucky. They had a dean, Anthony Erdley, who was an incredibly accomplished writer and architectural thinker. And it was magic. The school was magic. They had people there. They had Julian, who had been Corbusier's chief assistant. They had a guy who had been a chief assistant in Mies van der Rohe's office. They had people like Herb Green, Paul Amatuzzo, who had worked for Haydock, Daniel Liebeskin, who most people know now, Judy DeMaio, Peter Carl. I mean, there were about 15 incredibly accomplished young architects in that school. And it was a pressure cooker, but it was so inspiring. Going there was the best thing that could have happened to me. I actually found out or got a hint as to why I had wanted to be an architect for so many years. I did really well there, but mostly out of fear, because it was not a pat you on the back school. It was rip your eyeballs out if you didn't do the work. And so out of fear, I worked around the clock. And I finished there. I went to Yale for a master's degree. At that time, Yale was kind of celebrity architects school, and while I think in hindsight I learned a lot there, it was nowhere near the education I got at Kentucky. I think what I discovered at Kentucky was You know, if you knew about Michelangelo and you knew Palladio and you knew Corbusier, that was all you needed, because everybody else came from that. And that's what they pushed there. I mean, everything was about Corbusier. And maybe I was brainwashed, but I hit Yale right at the right in the middle of the postmodern period, and I was as far from a postmodernist as you could get, and it was incredibly difficult because every professor I had there was sold on postmodernism, and I was still trying to do my little Corbusier knockoffs, but I got through it, and I met some people that were really good friends who I learned a lot from, and that kind of completed my formal education. After that, we moved to Atlanta. I got a job with a really large firm there. The best thing about that was I worked for architect Max Scoggin, who has since been the Dean of Architecture at Harvard. He's done some really incredible projects. He was working at this firm, which was very corporate, but I loved the guy. I mean, I just loved him, man. His big thing was abstraction. You got to embrace abstraction. Architecture is just not about making pretty pictures. And I learned, I mean, I just tried to soak up everything Mac had to say, and we became really close. I think we're still good friends. And at a certain point, I left and moved back to North Carolina, not for any career architectural reasons. I think we moved back here because I felt like I had one last chance to be close with my father. I know this sounds like psychobabble, but that was really important to me, and I felt like I had to be close to have a relationship with him. So we moved back here, and I went to work for a very mediocre firm. I actually got to the point where I didn't, for the first time, I didn't like architecture at all. I dreaded going to work. The work we did was very ordinary. And I remember when it got to the point where I felt like I was losing my best friend and I couldn't take it anymore, I went over to state, and Bob Burns was the dean then, and I had called and set up a meeting with Bob, and I told him, I said, I think I used to be a pretty good architect, or at least have the potential, and I used to really love architecture, but I'm learning to hate it, and I feel like if you give me a chance to teach, I can turn this thing around. And for whatever reason, and I had no experience, he did. He gave me a chance to teach. I ended up teaching there off and on for 20-some years. And probably everything I've ever done in this profession, that was the most rewarding. It was probably the most inspiring. I loved teaching. I loved the students. I think I was more successful at that than anything else I've done in this profession, because that was easy. I was letting students inspire me, and I was letting students show me what was possible. And architecture is incredibly difficult. It does take passion. I mean, people say that like it's a cliche, but it does, because there's so many things you address when you're doing a building or working on a project, and there's so many things that are important. You're not just trying to make a box that you can stuff a function into. I mean, if you really love doing it, while I don't think architecture is art, I do think there are components of art that become part of the architecture. I mean, I think most architects are pretty good writers, and I think the reason most architects are pretty good writers is because there is a narrative aspect to architecture where if you're not telling a story and you don't have an idea behind the story, then it's going to be pretty mundane and pretty pedestrian. And even having that story, you have got to work it. I mean, you've got to constantly rework and rework. I remember being in London and going to this exhibit of Norman Foster's work, and the show at the BBC was kind of a comprehensive show of Norman Foster's work. But the thing I remembered most about it was there was one section where they had the work he did for the British Broadcasting Company's headquarters. And in one section, they had the study models they had done. And they weren't complete and they weren't finished, but they're fairly small scale. It must have been 100. I mean, literally. They all told the same story, but in different ways. And the fact that he had looked at it in that many different iterations really kind of blew me away, because I can remember one of the firms I worked for, which was not a terrific firm, had told me one time, "We don't build models here. That cuts into the profit line." I knew then that wasn't the best place for me to work, because I always felt like if you're going to be a good architect, it demands your best, whatever that is, whatever level that reaches. And I mean, just having taught as long as I did, there's so many talented young people out there doing architecture. But if you crush the spirit of that creative process, you can lose it all. I think teaching always made me kind of honest, at least honest in the sense that I couldn't go in there and be the cheerleader and wave the pom-poms for architecture and not take that with me when I went to work. I had to believe it as strongly in the work environment as I did in the school. So I would say I haven't taught in 4 or 5 years. I don't know why. I've had periods where I've tended to be a little opinionated and a little brash, and because I tend to get on this holy path where this is the way it should be done, and if you're not going to do it this way, then the hell with you. And that's a pretty bad attitude. And I look back sometimes and I think, the luckiest thing for me as an architect, I've had some incredible clients. I mean truly incredible people that were bright and interested and demanding, and they had ideas as well as I had ideas, and I don't think I would have done half of the projects that I feel good about without those kinds of clients. I mean, one client, and one of the better projects we've done, was a $400,000 renovation and addition to a client in Durham, Mark and Mimi Hansen, and it was just a joyful experience to work with them. They had bought a 50s modernist house, in my opinion, one of the best, very small, one of the best 50s modernist houses in this area. Like most architects, I thought, just give me a piece of property, we'll tear down whatever gets in our way and we'll start from scratch. But when I saw that house, they asked me to come look at it, and when I saw that house, I thought, this is a great context to work in. It's just interesting how you get certain clients. I always had this crazy idea. I really believed that, and maybe it's why I'm so pathetic as a marketer. I don't market well. I don't like to market, and I always had this idea that even what you do, if you put out the best work you can possibly put out, and you constantly strive for that kind of excellence, and you reach it occasionally, people will come to you. I don't mean to sound defeatist, but I don't think that's always true. I think you gotta get out there and find other ways to let people know that you're here and this is what you do and how well you can do it. Or sitting around waiting for the phone to ring is not real effective. It's just, we got one job from an interior designer in Chapel Hill. She called one day and said, I have a client from Kuwait. Would you like to meet with him? So of course, I thought, Kuwait, some money over there, black gold. So I said, I'd love to meet with him. And it was so funny because I was really nervous about it because I knew it was a big job for residential. I can't say how much, but it was probably as big as every other residential job we've done combined. So she brings him in, I'm waiting and anticipating, and he looked, he was an Arab, but he looked exactly like my best friend from high school. Down exactly. And I immediately was totally relaxed. Down to, by the time we were through, we were telling bad jokes and laughing like they were the funniest things we'd ever heard. And at the end of the meeting, he said, I've been to London and New York and Paris, and I've interviewed architects, and a lot of them were arrogant. A lot of them, they were all good architects. He said, but I want to work with you. And I'd hate to see a video of that interview, but it went really well. And I thought, he said, can you do a glass house in Kuwait? I feel like I can do anything if I have the right people working with me. I said, what's glass technology and what's possible with glass and custom design glazing systems? But I know there's some really good engineers that do. So if I can work with one of those, then I can do it. I don't know everything there is to know about mechanical systems and how they're going to work in the desert environment. But if I have the right plumbing, mechanical engineer that has worked in those environments, then I know we can do it. And what happened was we hired this incredible team of consultants. I'm not saying this in any sense of false humility, but I was probably the least accomplished of everybody on that team. The only thing I had was there was a story I wanted to tell about this man and this job. And if I could get the right people with the right vocabularies, it could be a hell of a good story. We worked on that job for a number of years, and it was such a rewarding experience. A different culture, client was a different culture, client was, I really care for him like I would a brother. He's just a dear friend of mine now. And he was incredibly talented. He had great ideas. Sometimes he would tell me, I've got a better idea than that. You learn to suck it up and listen. But it was just a great experience. And I think that's one thing that school did not prepare me for, is that if you have really, really good clients and you listen to them, and you start to understand that you're not building this house for yourself. You're building it for them, and you're not, everything's not going to go the way you want it to go. You certainly want them to like your work enough to want to see what you have to say, but you're going to say things they're not going to agree with, and you have to learn to listen and say, okay, let's try something else. I'm amazed at how often trying something else has been the best way to go, as opposed to trying to. I used to think, I could go into a client and say, look, I made this. It's perfect. I hope you go ahead and build it, because this is what you're going to get. Nobody wants to hear that stuff. In this case, the client said, not too sold on a 5-story house. I pushed it a little bit to find out how not too sold on a 5-story house they were. Turned out they weren't at all interested in a 5-story house. So we did a second scheme and a third. But I've always had clients that I really respected what they did. I've had some professors at Duke, did a project for the Dean of Product Design at State and his wife, Adnan, the Kuwaiti client, Joel Collins, who's a really good photographer, probably had more ideas than I would have liked to have heard. But I was amazed at how often they made the project better. I mean, he really had a really strong design sensibility, and he was really a good guy, and so was his wife. So, I mean, one thing George Smart has tapped into is this is an area with a lot of modern architecture, and there is a lot of good modern architecture, and he has been a real spokesman for that. As a result of that, especially in residential markets, there are architects like Frank Harmon, Bill Shostak, Marley Carroll, Jeffrey Lee. There are just a lot of really good modernist architects in this area. And I think we should all embrace that. I mean, when they built the museum, I was so thrilled. Didn't bother me for a minute that an out-of-town architect did it. The only thing I wanted to happen was I wanted him to do a great museum. So people would say, oh, so this is what architecture can do. When the light is right, when the siding of the building is right, when the spatial qualities are right, this is what you can get, as opposed to the old museum next door. And I think he did that. I think he gave this area, it's kind of like Paul Rudolph's Burroughs Welcome Building. He gave this area a really great building, unlike most buildings that we build, because we give up too easily. And people like Rudolph don't give up. Dorton Arena, somebody didn't give up. They did something very bold. It had a story to tell, and that made sense. So I feel fortunate. I actually feel fortunate to be here, to be in a place where there are other really good architects to meet with and talk to and see their work. And it makes it kind of pushes you a little bit to never do less than your best. Sounds like words from a bad country song, but sometimes your best just ain't good enough. And what do you do then? I think you just suck it up and you try again. And it takes a lot of work. Architecture is one of those professions where you can work for weeks, and at the end of the day, if you're honest with yourself, you have nothing. You may have learned something in the process, but you have nothing. Even if your client happens to like it and you know it's not good, you have to be able to go back to the start and do it again. And take every mistake you made and make that part of the process so you don't repeat it, and try to do something really good. And one thing that's been really good about working in a smaller office is we don't have a big staff. Everybody that comes in the office has to make a contribution to the projects. So we have to share certain kind of basic beliefs about what we're doing, or it's not going to work. And I've been lucky. I mean, I've had some of the best young architects in this area work here. For a while there, like Mark Ryer and Kathleen Mattingly, Kelly Hopkins, people tended to only stay maybe 3 years, and then they would go somewhere else. A number of reasons for that. One is I couldn't pay them what larger firms could pay them because the scale of our projects, we weren't generating big enough fees. But then John Caliendo came through here, who I think is one of the best young architects in North Carolina. Bob Thomas came through here, who actually, I'm very grateful he stayed here for a while, and he was incredibly driven, incredibly talented architect. But I think in some ways the office got to be a teaching environment. You know, I had these young assistants and I could teach them as much as possible. And I used to take great pride in people would leave this office and get a huge pay bump and go somewhere else. And I felt like maybe they were training themselves, maybe I was helping to train them, but when they left here, they were really, really good architects. The exception to that is probably Bob was a really good architect when he came here. That's always been important. You know, now what's funny is Alan Tin from China has been here the longest, probably the person that holds the office together. But then I have both my sons who studied architecture work here, which has been a joy for me personally. Even if they weren't any good, it would be a joy. The fact that Paul's one of the best students, and I had him as a student at State, one of the best students I ever had. And his work is so tight and precise and careful, and in the end, beautiful because of that. So having him here is, the work is better now than it was 2 years ago that comes out of this office. And Patrick, who is my youngest son, studied architecture at Harvard and then worked for Rem Koolhaus at OMA's New York office for 8 years. And he is the big, bold, visionary kind of architect, and he worked on projects in that office that are international in scale and scope. They're both sons are very different, but they work so well together. And right now we're doing some smaller projects, and I look at them and I see what Paul's doing, I see what Patrick's doing, and I think, damn, this is much better than me. I mean, I worked so hard and they passed me. They just kind of, but I think they really want this office to become more of a, and I do too, and they're not afraid to market, and they're not afraid to go out and meet people and say this is what we're doing. I think they would both really like to see this office now. If we have anything, maybe we have a good design reputation. But I think they would like it to be more than that. I think they would like to see this office become an office that attacks larger projects and more significant projects. And I think that's going to happen. I love working on houses. I love it. But there's not much. It's not very lucrative. And if you do a house with a really small budget and you still want to do the house the very best you can do it, I mean, no matter how many starts and restarts, no matter how many ways you try to invent to get an effect without spending maximum money. I mean, we worked on the house in Kuwait. It was fun, and parts of it were easy because we could basically do anything we wanted to. You know, we did a stainless steel window wall system with laminated glass and layers of sunscreens made out of glass. And but when you get one where you know the client is looking to you to give them something based on the way they want to live and a way to hopefully enhance the way they live, you're going to fight to break even. And one thing I would say, you know, for younger architects, I think the most important thing a young architect does is decide the first job. And if you're a young architect and you work for a really dynamic, interesting, committed firm, you're going to pick up all those habits. All your training is going to be based on that. And at the end of 3 years, you're going to be a better architect because of it. And I think what happens to so many architects, young ones, is one is the job market hasn't been great lately. And you've got to find a job somewhere. And when you take a job where the attitude is, don't do anything that cuts into our profits, I can understand that. Most businesses operate that way. But you want them to also say, this is our product. We want it to be as good as we can make it. And I don't think that always pays off in architecture. I mean, go out to the North Raleigh and look at what they build out there by the thousands. So that doesn't always translate into more work and better work. But if you're ever going to get in a position where you get to do better work, when people send resumes here, they send a resume, I look through it. First thing I want to know is not where they went to school. First thing I want to know is who have you worked for? And if you've worked for somebody that I feel like this person has made you better, suddenly you're pretty attractive as a prospective employee. If you haven't, it's like, what are you going to bring here? You can't retrain everybody that works here. So I used to always tell students, you have got to work harder than anybody else. And you have got to be the one, you either go to one of the top graduate schools or you go work for one of the top firms, and the only way they're going to hire you is if your work is a cut above the rest. Because if you don't get that job and you don't get that pedigree, you're going to you're just going to be in quicksand of mediocre architecture. And with each job, it's going to get harder and harder to get out of it. So, and I really believe that. I think we do a disservice to students if we don't make them think they can do it. Because most of my experience state, I mean, what an amazing architecture student body they attract. I mean, some really talented kids who are really committed and really can do good work. They just need to believe they can do it. So I was probably a lot more of a cheerleader than I was a professor or an instructor. But that's okay. I enjoyed seeing what they did. You know, right now we're making a big push to market some larger jobs, and I mean, we have a lot of potential out there. We've been shortlisted on a few. We've started doing some studies for some different companies and developers, and I really feel confident something will hit. But at the same time, I know when we market, we still want to market. You should hire us because not only are we good at this, we're not going to give you anything less than something that's really good. And we're going to surprise you at times, and we're going to push beyond what is acceptable, and hopefully there's and we believe there's great value in doing it. If you ask what is modernist architecture, one thing you have to do is look at the landscape of architecture now. I mean, there's no question we can tell what a 50s building looks like, and we can see a building and say, Oh, that was done in the 60s. And architecture now is very inclusive of so many different ideas, directions, materials. It's kind of like the culture, things are changing so quickly. So, one component of, I can do a 50s building. I don't think that's modernist. Because one component of modern architecture is how does it reflect the society and the technology of the time now, and what does it make possible that wasn't possible 15 or 20 years ago? Because if you don't address some of that, you're just going to spin your wheels. I can't give a checklist and say unadorned surfaces, no molding, garish colors, and kind of add it all up to modernism, because I know in most of the houses I do, I'm truly a Southern architect, and in terms of residential architecture, I am really driven by what makes really good Southern architecture. So I'm working right now on an addition and renovation to my house that I've been working on for about 9 years here and there. But one quality I really like that I grew up with, that I've lived in, is the quality of rooms. More Southern architecture has that quality of not big open spaces, but rooms and halls, and big halls that let air flow through a space. So I can define everything about that, and I don't know that anybody would say, well, that's modern. It probably was modern at one time, but it's not modern anymore. I think there's a danger with what's modernist now is you kind of look at what's being done and you do a variation on a theme, which I think I'd rather do something that's kind of not so good. But I think one thing about modern architecture is, for instance, I think in the last 15 years, I could give you a checklist of what, at least the perception of what a modern space is and what makes it modern. I mean, it has large, substantial, and you would recognize it. It has large, substantial areas of glass. It has maple floors that are polyurethane. It has open grand stairs that are open. It has very carefully designed furniture that works as objects in the space. And I could probably show you 50 images of modern interiors, and it wouldn't make a damn bit of difference where they were. They'd all be the same. That's unfortunate, because I look sometimes at some of the 50s houses, and they're not like that. They have quality, and they're modern, and they have qualities about them that are about when they were built, and about how they were built and how they were designed and what kind of spaces people lived in. I do think that our museum now is about as good a modern building as we have in the area. And it has, but I don't know if I'm qualified to tell you why. We can talk about the light in that building. And when you work with a tight budget, two things happen for us. One is we try to identify what's free. I mean, good light in the house, you don't have to pay extra to have it. Orient the house the right way, and you can have some control over how the sun comes in the house. All of that's kind of free. You can place a building on a site that takes advantage of what's around it and what your views are, and how you perceive the house from up close and from a distance, and none of that really costs you anymore. When you get into materials, the tricky part is there are a lot of times when you know this is the effect we want. We would really love to do this whole plane out of opaque glass that reflects the trees. And then we go look at the cost of that, and we know we can't do it. So how important is that effect? And if that effect is really important, if that effect is really important, then how can we achieve it for 1/10 the budget? And when we worked on the Collins house, there were a lot of things we wanted to do that Bob and I spent a lot of time looking at materials. I mean, the main facade of that house, I was convinced 100% should be glass, should be opaque glass. The trees that surround that house, it should reflect them almost like a picture. But when we looked at the cost, and we kind of did a line item budget of what the house should cost, we weren't even close. We didn't have a prayer. So we found some plastic that they use for shipping cartons. Literally 1/10 the cost of the opaque glass. Not quite as reflective as we wanted, but we panelized it, and I think it looks great. I just think, why would you do that? And that's kind of self-serving. But it's just such a personal, I mean, on one level, architecture is very competitive. We're always trying to get the job we want, and so are 5 other people. And a lot of times there's a lot of disappointment in architecture, but when it's right, and when it works, and when you feel like you kind of laid it out there and you got it right, there's nothing better. It's just a joyful experience. And I think that's what we work for. I think we work for that reward. And the disappointments are what they are. They move on to the next one. It's not like we're not going to get an Oscar. And there's a great quote I read in one of a book that's put out by Yale. And I do think a lot of architects are kind of, I remember when I definitely was, I think a lot of architects are celebrity driven. They want to be a celebrity. And there was a quote written by the wife of a really famous architectural philosopher. And she was talking about architects like Robert Stern and Frank Gehry and Zaha Hadid. And she said, her quote was, I think she was talking about in the history of time, never have so many been so well known by so few. And I thought that was great because it's true. Walk out on the street and ask somebody who Thomas Pfeiffer is, the guy that designed the museum. I doubt if you find anybody that knows who he is, unless you go over to State and walk around the school. You ask them who Michael Jackson was, you'd probably get 99.9%. But so I don't think architecture is, as much as you'd like to think architecture is going to change the world, I don't think architecture is going to change the world. I think it has the potential to make life in this world better when it's done well. But I don't think people in Syria are too concerned about the architectural quality over there. It's not going to change what they go through every day. And I think in architecture, you need a little humility. You need to be able to say, and you need to feel good about it. Say, this is the best I can do. That's it. That's as good as I can do it. And the next time, try to do it a little better if you're not worn out. I mean, it is tiring, as you know. Anytime you do something that's visual and something that's creative, it's tiring because you can see the results so clearly. And if you're honest, you know if the results have anything at all to do with what you were trying to do or where you were trying to go with it. And the question is, how do you deal with it when they don't? And I think you just start over. From your perspective, I wish a lot of movie makers would take that attitude. This movie really stinks. Let's just start over. Because a lot of them do. A lot of them are really beautiful.